I want to reflect especially on the medium that we're using and this problem that I have, which is that I am talking to a camera and I'm pretending to be talking to you. I'm sort of talking to you, but I'm looking at a camera. There's so much distance involved in that. Anyway, the thing that I want to point out, I would like you to reflect on the medium of our engagement here. You're watching a movie that I made, right? And you can't give me input as I speak. So the thing that I really have a problem with, and I think we need to overcome, is that makes this a one-way communication. And because this is a one-way communication, this reinforces a model of education with which I profoundly disagree. And by the way, there's a whole like economic move towards online education. If professors are teaching online, then they are not physically next to one another, which makes it harder for them to unionize. It makes it harder for them to develop any kind of solidarity. It makes it harder for them to recognize the interests they share with one another. It makes it harder for them to push against management. In addition, online education cuts private corporations into what in our case otherwise would be a public educational circumstance. And that's because the platforms, Blackboard, the platforms on which online courses are run by private companies. So anyway, the main problem here is that this is a one-way communication. I cannot see how you respond to how I talk, and so I can't be sensitive. I can't express my own ignorance as easily or as honestly as I could if we were in the room. I can't see if you're reacting, if I've said something wrong, if I said something dumb, if I was just incorrect, if I was insensitive. I can't see where in my comments your attention is peaked and where it's wandering. I can't tell. And the main thing that I think you're not going to hear me say that much in these lectures, because you're not here, is I don't know. And that's something I'll say a lot. I'm sure a whole bunch of you know all kinds of things that I don't know. I'm positive about that. I mean, all of you know all kinds of things that I don't know. But you can't tell me about them in real time here. And so as I'm speaking, I may be saying things that just ring wrong or seem problematic or go around what you take to be the main point or assume something that you're not sure you want to assume. And I can't, our bodies are not together. I can't read your bodies. I can't read your behavior. And we can't start to develop this kind of trust that comes from people responding to one another and respecting one another and laughing together and sort of pushing on one another, which is something that maybe I'm not so good at all kinds of things, but one thing I think I'm pretty decent at is in an actual classroom, causing some kind of sometimes quite edgy conversation to occur. So, and while I'm at it, reflecting on the medium and whatnot, let me also acknowledge right from the beginning, I'm totally aware that I am a middle-aged white guy talking about the oppression of non-white people by white people historically. And insofar as I'm the leader of this course, I'm the authority in this course, I'm continuing to practice a certain role of whiteness, which is totally problematic, which is part of the whole set of dynamics that we need to analyze in this course. So again, I need your help in order to dethrone the white guy. And, I'd be really appreciative if you could work on that. So, content. Let's get into the content of the course. I'll start by talking about this text, the De Las Casas text, and its origin. So this text was written by a guy named Bartolome de las Casas, who, by the time he wrote the text, was a priest. He's a person who, at a young age, he was from a fairly well-to-do Spanish family. He went to the newly conquered Hispaniola within probably the first decade of the Spanish presence there. So Christopher Columbus, who we're all supposed to adore, after whom the city in which my family in Ohio lives. There's a number of cities in the United States named Columbus. There's a whole bunch of statues commemorating Columbus, this great man, this great explorer, supposedly, came across the Atlantic, was, as I said a moment ago, in search of a new trade route by which to connect Spain and the East. And this, of course, in order to generate the fortunes of all kinds of Spanish business people. This is the goal. He arrives, the first significant place that he arrives, by which I mean the first place where they stop and they establish themselves and they take control. They stopped at one or two islands before they hit this big island, but they hit this big island and then they stayed. And very quickly, they basically genocide the population. I should not say basically. They destroy the entirety of the population. Upwards of 500,000 people get killed on this island by the Spanish. So Columbus had shown up there, and in good European fashion, he names it Hispaniola. So this is, they keep naming things after Spain, right? But eventually Mexico would be New Spain. Sometimes there's references to Venezuela and Peru. The what used to be the Incan Empire get called New Spain. So the Spanish are naming everything after themselves, right? It used to be some other people. Now it's us. So early on in the occupation of Hispaniola, Bartolomé de las Casas, as a young man, late teens, showed up, and he would have been given an allotment of land, and I'll talk more about what that system was in a moment. He would have been assigned a certain number of indigenous people as his servants. Technically, well, he probably would have had slaves too. They did make a legal distinction between slavery and some variety of servitude, but in practice, indigenous people systematically became enslaved to the Spanish, and they were assigned to different individuals based on their status and their power and their rank. De las Casas would have had people working for him, and because at the time that he arrived on Hispaniola is the island that is now Haiti and the Dominican Republic. At the time that he arrived there, the entirety of the island had not been completely colonized. I mean, there were pockets of independent people left over, and so there were regular raids carried out by young Spanish men in order to subjugate the remnants of the population on that island. So he took part in that stuff. He was, in this sense, a conquistador. But there was already a debate going on between different monastic factions, representatives of whom had already landed on Hispaniola, about this key question, which I want to come back to later, because I think it's a question that can connect to us in a whole bunch of ways. And that question is, do the Indians have souls? And this is an important question because if they have souls, then they need to be respected in certain ways. If they have souls, perhaps they have rights that they would not have otherwise. And so the more violent and militaristic portions of the conquistador population, which is fairly darn violent and militaristic to begin with, had an interest in denying the ensoulment of Indians, because if they have no souls, they're just sophisticated animals. They kind of look like us, but kind of not, because their skin is a funny color and their faces are shaped strangely and their proportions are somewhat different. There are all these sort of what we would call superficial distinctions between the way that the natives looked and the way that the Spaniards looked, which could be drawn upon willfully in order to demonstrate or to ground the inhumanity of these people. So this debate was going on. There's also sort of an interest on the other side, which is not benign either. The faction that wanted to say, hey, the Indians do have souls, that was kind of ideologically and practically necessary in a way too, because part of the legitimation of the Spanish enterprise, which I think most people would say had to do with gold. It was about the acquisition of money. It was about mineral resources. And this is basically what they did to all the people that they subjugated. They forced them into mines, or they forced the men into mines, and then they made the women do agricultural work largely for the Spaniards. But the cover, and a key component too, of this conquest was Christianizing. But you can't Christianize somebody who has no soul, right? There's no point in preaching Christianity to your dog or to a leopard. Leopards aren't going to get it. And even if it was a super smart leopard and they did get it, but they had no soul, then if you believe in Christianity, there would be no meaning in Christianity for that leopard, because Christianity is about the relationship between the soul and the divine, and about the future of that soul. So if you're engaged in a colonial expedition, and part of how you understand what you're doing, part of how you make yourself feel better about what you're doing, but maybe something that you actually earnestly believe, if you think that part of that is bringing Christianity, giving this gift of Christianity to previously benighted, ignorant people, they have to have souls. So even those on this side of the debate, Indians have souls, they were not necessarily defenders of the Indians. This, however, is the title that Bartolomé de las Casas was eventually given. Oh, by the way, my Spanish pronunciations are obviously horrible. Feel free to correct me about them. I am not under any delusion that I'm good at that. I was raised in rural Ohio in a totally monolingual situation, and I have suffered as a result of it, and now you will suffer too. Anyway, so this is who De las Casas is, and there's already this debate going on the island at the time that he arrives, and he gets involved in it, and he becomes a proponent of the ensoulment of the Indians. Now, I don't think, this is a key question that we should be talking about in our discussions. I don't think that he is totally capable of seeing them as full human beings, or as human beings in the exact same way that he was a human being. And I say that because when I read this text, it looks to me like he still considers them savages. There are this is a key thing that we'll return to through the course. There's sort of two ways in which colonized peoples tend to be looked at by the Europeans who colonized them. And we're looking at European colonization, which is not to say that there was no other colonization in the past. But in this particular instance, Europeans tend to refer to non-European people, colonized people, as savages. And the concept of savagery has probably two dimensions, or two manifestations. There's bad savages and there's good savages. The bad savages are supposedly bestial, animal-like, untrustworthy, hyper-violent. They understand force and not much else. They are barbarians. And of course, if you encounter a batch of savages, probably the only thing you can do is defend yourself and kill them, right? So referring to an enemy, referring to a population that you are in the process of subduing as savages, is a kind of ideological screen or defense or legitimation, rationalization of what you're up to. It makes soldiers feel better. Here's a connection to the present. It's probably the case that most soldiers, most places, have benefited from dehumanizing their enemy. So there's the dehumanized, violent, barbaric savage. But then there's another manifestation of the savage, which I see in De las Casas, and which I also see in Rousseau, although Rousseau's account is more hypothetical and fictionalized. And this term comes from Rousseau. The term is noble savage. The idea here is that native peoples, colonized peoples, prior to their colonization, lived in innocence. They are less corrupted than so-called civilized people. They're simpler. They're more honest. They're more in touch with nature. And this also is a falsification, right? So the noble savage typically has no history. Of course, the Taino, who were the people who lived on Hispaniola, or the Aztecs and the Mayans and the Incans, these were, especially the Aztecs and the Incans, and the Mayans, these were hyper-developed cultures. They were cultures with 1,000-year histories, with histories of imperial warfare, with histories of technological development, with histories of scientific discovery. When the Europeans see them as noble savages or barbaric savages, that history is erased. The pretense is that history is happening from the direction of the Europeans. History has been brought to these people in 1510, 1517, whatever it is. So even when De las Casas categorizes the Indians, I think he falsifies them, and he tends to see them as noble savages. He says many times that they had weapons, but what sorts of weapons, he says, such as are used by children, not by full-grown men, sticks and stones. He describes them on many occasions as behaving in a childlike manner. So he doesn't overcome his own racism. He doesn't overcome his own Eurocentrism, I suppose. But he tries. And in this respect, he becomes a really notable, exceptional individual. I'm not sure what his life must have been like, because he was increasingly critical of the Spanish conquest, and yet he continued to accompany the conquistadors. So, if you look through this book, then you've got all these different locations, right? I mean, we're talking about Hispaniola, St. John in Jamaica, Cuba, Mexico, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Guatemala, and these are just the ones that I had you read in the first 35 pages. He was there. And I believe that he had a somewhat strange idea, wishful idea, that colonization, the conquest, the bringing of American peoples into the Spanish world, the capitalist world, the Christian world, could be done without the sword. I think what De las Casas wanted was to bring the cross without the sword. And he attempted this at one point in Venezuela. They set up a mission. I think he was an earnest Christian at some level. He really believed that there is such a thing as salvation. And either you've got Jesus in your heart and you have converted and devoted yourself to him, or you haven't. And if you haven't, then of course you're condemned to hell forever. Maybe he really thought all these savages were going to go to hell or some kind of limbo, and he was bringing them connection to this heavenly reality. Maybe he really thought that. So they tried this mission in Venezuela, and it was totally pushed out. The native people had no interest in losing their culture, losing their way of life, and converting to one that had no meaning to them. This cross and this Bible and this Word of God nonsense. I'm not picking on you Christians, by the way, but from the perspective of a non-Christian people, Christianity is about as intelligible as any religion you never heard of, right? So they had no interest. I think this is an important fact to realize. Even for those people who earnestly thought that they were expanding Christianity for the benefit of the recipients, never succeeded. Christianity never expanded, and capitalism never expanded without the sword. There's always the sword. It's the Bible and the sword. And when we get to, Africa in the middle of the 1800s, it's the Bible and the gun. And we're going to see these things repeated all the time. And if you wanted to generalize that, there's raw force and there's ideology. These two things are always going together. Okay, so this is De las Casas, and he increasingly becomes a critic, and he engages in real disputes and legal disputes with other members of the conquistador leadership, and eventually governors and landowners who had taken control. He argued with them, and he tried to argue with them in the Spanish court. And so the book that you have here is his writing basically to persuade the Spanish court to go easy on the Caribbean, to go easy on the New World, to reverse what he saw as truly horrific, hellish, sinful, cruel, barbaric behavior on the part of the Spaniards, who he nevertheless continued to accompany. So he was eventually given the title Defender of the Indians. He was given that title by the Spanish court. So he's writing this stuff to try and persuade the authorities back on the peninsula, back in Spain, to use their authority to alter the pattern of behavior of their troops. And he had some sympathy there. I think the civilized people back in Spain would rather think that they were civilized, that they were not engaged in such wholesale slaughter, at least some of them. And so he was given this title. He tried working with governors in Mexico and Central America. And I think he held the position for about 2 years until they basically pushed him out. They were quite powerful. He was not quite as powerful, although he did become an archbishop, I think. And he was eventually pushed out of that position. Okay, so that's who he is. Why does this text matter for us? It matters because, first of all, we want to look at, what's the founding moment? Like, what is it that establishes the preliminary relationships of power that grow into the world that we now know, and that grow into the series of revolutions that we're looking at in this class? And this is the moment. There are parallel moments, but this is a seminal moment. And this is a genocide of millions of people. So we want to be very clear that this is how it all starts. This is how at least this phase of the history of control and revolt starts, with the imposition of European culture, European religion, European economic system, which at this point favors gold, and which within a couple of 100 years will favor agricultural production, because it can make gold, and it'll require slavery for these purposes. Diverse parts of the world are forced into a new system with which they had no connection before. It's done forcibly, it's done through genocide, it's done through torture, not to mention that it's done by disease. When the Europeans show up, they literally take the people and throw them into the ground, the men particularly, into the ground, where they mine until they die very early. They have very little to eat. The entirety of their culture is destroyed. They are forced either to take oaths of loyalty, and those who do not are declared rebels. The Spaniards actually go and destroy the temples. For example, in Mexico, the temples of the Aztecs, they destroy the statues representing their gods. And they force people to become Christians. They take all the money. They take all the things of value. They enslave everyone. It is hyper harsh. And this is where we start. Another last note on that point, I suppose, the region that we're looking at here today is quite important too. So we're in the Caribbean, and then we're in Mexico, and in the northern bit of South America. This is important because this is the first landing place, but it's also the place that becomes the heart of the slave trade. The Caribbean becomes the heart of the slave trade, and it's the place that gives birth to a number of the writers that we're reading. It's also a place where slavery was early instantiated, but where a whole history of revolts and the establishment of autonomous slave communities or maroon communities happened. So revolts and the establishment of free non-European slave communities happened in Jamaica, Barbados, Suriname, Haiti, Cuba. And then, of course, these are also places where some of the key revolutions happened, Haiti and Cuba. And it's the Caribbean from which a number of our writers come. So C.L.R. James and Frantz Fanon are from Martinique. Stokely Carmichael was from Trinidad. Okay, part 2 of the lecture. What's in it? What's in the text? Now, this is this is a little bit weird to do as an online lecture, because I actually don't, aside from the strangeness and the age of the writing style, I don't feel like there's too much that is confusing in this text. So if we were in a classroom, I would just ask you guys to share, what struck you, because, it's super striking, right? It's horrible. So I'll just list off very quickly what I see here. The character of the text, and then I'll ask you, if you didn't read it, go read it. This is a document of atrocities and genocide. It purports to be a first-hand eyewitness account of these atrocities. There's another text that I used to include in this class that was written around the same time by a guy named Diaz del Castillo. And he also was a conquistador, and he became the governor of Guatemala and Chiapas. And in his account, there's no genocide at all. There's no torture at all. And none of this stuff ever happened. So I suppose you could put into question the veracity of this text. I think that if you really looked into it, you'd find that this is basically correct. I'm not sure how accurate De las Casas numbers are. He gives us 800,000 dead in Mexico, for example, but that may well be about correct. I mean, they're huge numbers. So he's just documenting outright slaughter, and not just slaughter of warriors. First of all, the warriors that are slaughtered in most cases attempted to welcome the conquistadors, and then they attempted to work out some kind of mutually beneficial arrangement. They were often sabotaged, they were ambushed, they were destroyed. But it wasn't only the warriors. Of course, it was the women and the children, and these are the kinds of things that De las Casas is giving an account of over and over and over. There's one passage which I meant to look up, but I didn't, where he says, what the Spaniards would do in each case was to arrive at a location and then carry out something it's like a precautionary massacre. They would just destroy everybody, but they didn't just, knife them and let them fall. They tortured them. They cut babies out of the bellies of pregnant women. They roasted people alive. They hung groups of a dozen or 13 people, which supposedly references the 12 disciples plus Jesus. They would hang them and burn them at the same time. They took babies and threw them up the air and caught them on their swords. They threw babies, into waterfalls. They burned people alive slowly. They burned people's feet until the feet exploded and the people eventually died. I mean, just every horrific thing they could think of, they did. There's this tragic, strange, troubling sport character to what he shows the Spanish doing. Anyway, what he says is they would do such things when they showed up at a particular location so as to terrify everyone else. So you could say that this whole movement, this movement of colonization, the expansion of capitalist and Christian Europe outward over the rest of the world, which increasingly has an economic character, it's also an explosion of human cruelty. It produces playgrounds where people who, I'm sure, if those conquistadors, if those officers, if those priests were back in Spain, they would have behaved in just as mannered a way as everyone else. And they would have respected, basic rules about violence and murder in the same way as everyone else did. They would have understood that to harm, to beat, to stab, to kill another individual is impermissible except in self-defense. And yet these same individuals, who I really think must have been relatively civilized people back on the peninsula, they show up in this new territory. There's this game or this terrible logic going on where the people that they meet are in their own minds not people. And what happens is the opening up of a whole river of cruelty, which to me raises big questions about, what does this tell us about people and what people are capable of? And you want to put that into connection with the present, which is always what we should do. Then recognize what happens with soldiers. You raise kids to understand that murder is wrong, killing is wrong, violence is wrong, taking is wrong, controlling others' bodies is wrong. You don't have a right to other people's bodies. These are all the things that we teach our kids and that we have been taught. But then soldiers, a large part of their training is to reverse that civilization, moralization process. And then you let them loose in a territory where either you tell them directly, or there's a habit in the culture of understanding that the people that you're dealing with are not fully people. So the word Indian or the word savage or the word noble savage, I think of them as part of the same history as terms like terrorist. Angela Davis is going to talk about this later in our class. Terrorists are by definition people who are irrational, people who are driven by bestial or evil intentions, and because they're irrational, they are beyond the range of possible discussion. You can't reason with them, therefore you can only kill them. And then a whole bunch of racist terms which are used by, and I always focus on Americans, not because of a particular hatred for America, but because I am an American, we are in America, and therefore the behavior of Americans is the thing of primary interest to us. I think it's much less important to criticize other nations, although of course this same phenomenon happens all over the place. Indian, by which I mean the nation India, Indian soldiers are trained to think of Pakistani soldiers as, less, Muslim soldiers as, less valuable than Hindu soldiers. Pakistani soldiers are taught to feel the same way about Indians. Russian soldiers behave in Chechnya in ways similar to how American soldiers behaved in Vietnam or in Iraq or in Afghanistan. And all the the racist terms, like the Americans often refer to Muslim fighters as like hajis. These terms allow people to ignore the humanity of others, and that whole moral script, which probably is experienced as repressive, right? We all have a whole lot of aggressive impulses. We have hates and fears and insecurities, and we would probably like to just fuck some people up. There's probably, morality requires repression. I have to check my instincts, and there's a sort of pressure that goes on with that. In the land of the other, in the land of the enemy, these instincts need no longer be repressed. There's something, this is what's terrible, I think. There's something joyous about the destruction that the Spanish carry out of the indigenous people they find. Just something to think about, I suppose. I am at the bottom of page 10, so I'm like right at the beginning of our reading. Which the Spaniards no sooner perceived, but they, mounted on generous steeds, well weaponed with lances and swords, begin to exercise their bloody butcheries and stratagems, and overrunning their cities and towns, spared no age or sex, nay, not so much as women with child, but ripping up their bellies, tore them alive in pieces. They laid wagers among themselves, who should with a sword at one blow cut, or divide a man in two, or which of them should decollate or behead a man with the greatest dexterity. Nay, farther, which should sheathe his sword in the bowels of a man with the quickest dispatch and expedition. So these are all, archaic terms, but you get the basic idea, right? Like, these are horrible descriptions of violent murder. They snatched young babes from the mother's breasts, and then dashed out the brains of those innocents against the rocks. Others they cast into rivers, scoffing and jeering them, and called upon their bodies when falling with derision, the true testimony of their cruelty, to come to them, and inhumanely exposing others to their merciless swords, together with the mothers that gave them life. They erected certain gibbets, large but low made, that's like, gallows, but low made so that their feet almost reached the ground, every one of which was so ordered as to bear 13 persons in honor and reverence, as they said blasphemously, of our Redeemer and his 12 apostles, under which they made a fire to burn them to ashes whilst hanging on them. But those they intended to preserve alive they dismissed, their hands half cut and still hanging by the skin, to carry their letters missive to those that fly from us and lie skulking on the mountains as an exprobation of their flight. So they want to scare and intimidate everyone who's not there by mutilating all the people that are. I want to talk about power relations, a set of power relations. I think it's important to ask, what was going on when the Spanish took over the New World in general, and more specifically, what was it that drove these men and enabled these men to do what they did, to do this horrific thing, which then became in their own understanding and in their own history, and in the history that our kids are still taught, which then became a glorious thing. Glorious Columbus. What are the power relations? Well, first of all, there's this kind of growing capitalism in Europe, and depending on who you read, they'll allow that, in 1500 capitalism was growing, or they'll say, well, no, this was still proto-capitalist, and capitalism didn't really happen until the 1700s. But there certainly was the emergence of certain features of capitalism. There was the concentration of wealth in banking houses, for example. But there was also, the attempt of each of these each of these European powers to compete against its neighbors and to gain more wealth for its merchants. So there's this growing merchant class. There's also nation states being grown, and Spain becomes a power ultimately because of its access to these vast reserves of gold. So on the one hand, you have these conquistadors being pushed from Spain into the New World, and they are all manner of man. Some of them are from well-to-do families. Many of them are not. They are out for gain. They are out for adventure. In many cases, they were already murderers and thieves and scoundrels. And I think the other important thing to add here, David Graeber wrote this book in the past few years called Debt. And one of the points that he makes is that the majority of the conquistadors were themselves in debt. Cortez was himself in debt and never really succeeded in getting himself out of debt. And at the same time, they started in debt. So my point is, one of the pressures driving these men into the New World is their subjugation, their exploitation, and their need to overcome that where they came from. So they're being driven by something. And even, Cortez, for example, he totally nickeled and dimed his own troops about everything, so that instead of them ending up with big cuts of the gold, some of them did well in the long run, but they were given land. But instead of their becoming marvelously rich, Cortez actually was charging them for their armor, for their horses, for the passage of their horses, for their rations during the trip. And where it looked like they had succeeded in winning all this gold and booty, instead they ended up owing Cortez money. So there's this hierarchical economic and social control system which is acting upon these individuals to begin with. And then, of course, there's the large-scale demand for gold, which is luckily achieved. And we used to read Adam Smith in this course. I cut him out because students last semester said they didn't like him, didn't like that text very much. But Smith had a probably reasonable attitude about the Spanish project. And he's like, look, the Spanish went out with the goal of achieving gold. But he's like, mining is like a notoriously risky enterprise because it's really hard to find and it's really hard to extract mineral wealth. So the Spanish basically, he thought, did a stupid thing, and then they got lucky. They got lucky and they did find the gold. And once the gold started coming, of course, there's pressure for more of it. And then, of course, under this banner, covering this stuff up, there's the ideology of Christianity. And some people do think, this famous Bulgarian writer named Todorov, really thought that Cortez's primary motivation was actually Christianity. And even though when he wrote to Queen Isabella in Spain, he spoke at length about gold and much less about religion, maybe he did that because he knew she wanted gold. Maybe his goal was really to be a hero, to be a hero of the faith, to expand Christianity to foreign peoples. Maybe that's what they wanted. So there are these forces driving them, economic forces. And a circuit develops, sending troops west and gold back east. And this is growing the power of Spain. And it's basically growing one of the first nation states, a relatively unified, centralized structure with a growing national language and national identity. This happens to a greater degree in France, coming out of the French Revolution under Napoleon. But it happens, first of all, with Spain. Like, the modern European nation state is arguably constructed on the basis of New World gold. So there's this inertia that is developing in that movement, and this is forcing people. But then the other thing I want to say is there's another variety of power relationship going on, and that is what I mentioned a moment ago, and that has to do with the psychology of the conquistadors, their ability to dehumanize whoever they ran into, or alternately, their inability to understand that the people they ran into were fully human. I mean, there are amazing things that the conquistadors were able not to notice. They didn't notice that, some of the structures they were running into when they showed up in Mexico were astronomical devices. They were able to continue to believe that these were completely uneducated, unintelligent people, even though they saw cities, which, even Cortez acknowledged, like, hey, look, the irrigation systems they've got here, they exceed anything that we've seen in Spain. They could, on the one hand, see this stuff, and then on the other hand, just continue to believe that these people are backwards, they don't matter, and killing them is no big deal. So there's that ideology component, the ability to think, I'm Christian, those other people are infidels. I'm human, those other people are more like animals. I'm guided by morality and law, those other people are outside of morality and law. And this is also a feature of power relations that we want to talk about as we go along. I think it's probably the result of a long-term ideological development, long-term distributions of ideas within Europe. Probably the result of long and bloody wars between Christians and Muslims, the result of the Crusades, and the result of the Moorish and Muslim presence within Spain. All these different historical conflicts which set groups of people against one another contribute to categories of perception, ways in which we perceive others, and that's a power relation too. Now, to speak a little bit more concretely for a moment, what was it that the Spanish did when they showed up at a particular territory? What did they do to that territory? I want to talk specifically about the so-called encomienda system, which then becomes the hacienda system, which stays in place effectively even through the 1810 Mexican Revolution, up until the 1910 Mexican Revolution, at which point large number of oppressed groups rise up against the regime of Porfirio Diaz, who was in bed with all the capitalists in the world and acting against the interests of nearly all Mexicans. Nearly. The encomienda system is a land and labor organizational system, I suppose. So the first thing to recognize is that the Taino people on Haiti, they didn't organize their land, they didn't organize their power structure like Europeans did. In Europe, you had a feudal system where territories were controlled hierarchically by a lord and then the vassals around the lord who had armed troops, and they controlled a certain amount of territory, and they technically owned that territory, and the people who lived upon that land and worked it had an obligation to stay there. They were enserfed. They were chained to the land. Bigger lord, more land, more serfs. Smaller lord, less land, less serfs. This is, very roughly speaking, European social economic organization. And when the Spaniards show up on Haiti, which is what the Taino called it, they imposed that system. So they physically mapped out territory and laid things out largely in rectangles, and then they assigned chunks of land to lords based on their prestige, and then they obligated existing people there to give their labor to the lords. So they enserfed Haiti. Actually, they enslaved a whole bunch of Taino people and sold them and treated them as objects and as property. But in addition to this, there were individuals who were not named slaves, but who were effectively slaves. And there were laws governing what landowners were supposed to do, but there's no enforcement of laws. So they were not supposed to just take the lives of whoever opposed them, but there was no pragmatic, no concrete force to check them doing that. So they actually did have power of life and death over these large numbers of people. That's the system that gets imposed on Mexico and on South America and on Central America. Division and encirclement and enslavement. And then what do they do to these people? They rip their culture away from them. They tell them that they're Christians. They tell them some things about Christianity. And I mean, it always baffles my mind how meaningless the acceptance of Jesus Christ by a person who comes from a different culture and never heard of this stuff must have been. I mean, this is raw force on a verbal level. And I mean, I think that's worth thinking about in a whole bunch of ways. You know, to what degree, when we accept dogmatic truths, dogmatic truth is one that you're supposed to accept without a reason. Like, I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, whose only Son was crucified, born, etc. That's the Apostles' Creed. I was raised in a church. That's why I have it memorized. That's a dogma. You're supposed to, in order to be a Christian, you're supposed to accept that. So there's force involved in any dogmatic acceptance of things. Anyway, so they impose this whole economic system. They destroy the culture that was there before. They destroy the economy that was there before. They super subjugate all of the people, all the ones that they don't kill and cook and maim and rape. And they effectively spread the property system and the authoritarian system that was existent in Spain in a new fashion to the New World. But here it's even harsher, because while there were some rules and practices governing the use of violence, for example, rape and murder, there's some checks upon those. Not enough in Spain, but in the New World there are none. There's no police to police the police. We still have that problem in some ways. And the last thing I would say is that what colonization achieved was something quite perverse, and it's something that probably still goes on today. We'll see this with Marx, and that is that the labor of the colonized people, the time, the energy, the bodily actions, the things that make up life on a material basis of these people is turned against them. It is used to rob their own land and to give gold and ultimately, eventually, agricultural products and other resources to somebody else. So you turn the colonized person into a person who works against themselves. They work to gut and pass away the wealth of their own nation. They steal the wealth of their own nation. They mine, for example, the wealth of their own nation in order to pass it elsewhere. It's not just that they're getting robbed. They're being forced at gunpoint, or in this case, at sword point, to rob themselves. When Marx comes along and talks about contemporary capitalist relationships, he'll say, this is what happens with the working class too. We are forced to work so as to enrich our masters.